Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started here. I'm Stephanie Verdia. I'm a principal planner with the Office of Planning and Development. And with me today is Christine Johnston. She's an attorney at Drummond and Woodsum Law Firm. Christine is with us today because she has extensive experience in municipal land use law. Her work with cities, towns, village districts on a wide variety of issues, mostly ranging land use regulation and enforcement, preparing towns for their annual town meeting, and the adoption and amendment of zoning and ordinances. So Christine has graciously agreed again to stick around with us for today if we run over. And again, please be respectful in keeping in mind that if you do have questions for Christine after the webinar, please keep them focused on the materials presented today. So again, welcome to It's Zoning Amendment Time. And Christine, again, thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate your time and your expertise.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, sure. So let's get into the agenda. I would normally sing It's the Most Wonderful Time of the Year, like I used to sing for my board members, but I will not sing for you today. So today's agenda is we're going to go through basic zoning, again, kind of the foundation. Whenever we talk about zoning amendments, just kind of get a feel of what zoning is, where it came from. I'm going to discuss what a zoning amendment is, what you should be considering for zoning amendments, the legislative body process. And then Christine is going to take over for a bit and then introduce us to the amendment process for the building and fire code adoption, which is something I think is really important and a lot of people may not be aware of. So I'm really looking forward to the addition of Christine and her expertise this year for the building code and fire code adoption and amendment process. Then we're going to get into the notification requirements, ballot requirements, and the best practices that we recommend as far as prepping and presenting your zoning amendments. And then, of course, our Q&A. So generally accepted for zoning, there are two components that make up your zoning ordinance or your rule book, okay, zoning for your community. And that is the zoning ordinance and the zoning map. So, each municipality can decide whether or not they want zoning, and they have to go through just the certain, there's RSAs that municipalities need to follow in order to get to zoning, and the RSAs that give them that power to do that. And the first one is the grant of power, where the state has authorized municipalities to adopt zoning. You run to 674-17, which describes the purposes of zoning and why communities could adopt them. And then it's 674-18, the adoption of the zoning ordinance. So in addition to the adoption of the grant of power and the adoption of zoning ordinances, RSA 674-20 districts also talks about the zoning and zoning map. It says in part, and in order to carry out and accomplish the purposes of zoning, which was found in 674-17, the local legislative body may divide the municipality into districts, also known as zones, which that turns into or translates into the zoning map. That geographically shows all the districts, usually color-coded, and describes them for their purpose and their identification. So those are your two major components of your zoning in your community. You've got the zoning ordinance, which is your rule book, and the zoning map, which identifies and lays out where those districts are. And so in order for a community to adopt a zoning ordinance, they have to authorize the creation of a planning board done at the through the legislative body, which is either your town meeting, or city council or town council form of government. Once the planning board has been authorized, the planning board's first things to do are to adopt bylaws, work on the master plan, the adoption and creation of the master plan, and they elect officers. So once the planning board gets their administrative homework done, then the next step would be for the legislative body, again through town meeting or city council, town council form of government. The legislative body would authorize the planning board to review subdivisions and approve subdivisions, which then in turn would empower the planning board to create and implement and adopt subdivision regulations. Once you move through the planning board getting subdivision regulation authority, the next step could be whether or not the community wants to decide whether or not to adopt zoning. And so that's where the community, again, through the legislative body process, would authorize the planning board, according to RSA 674-16, to authorize, prepare, and adopt a zoning ordinance. Now, the community can decide to stop at that point and just stick with, the planning board or just having subdivision review authority. They could then turn to adopt zoning. So if the community moves forward and decides to adopt zoning, then that would also empower the planning board through the legislative body process to adopt site plan regulations. So you can't have site plan regulations without zoning. So that's kind of an important threshold to understand. So that communities that don't have zoning, the planning board has no say over multifamily developments or any commercial type development or change of use in businesses or anything like that. So zoning is the key link to site plan regulations and the planning board's authority to review site plans. The planning board also has the authority through they hold public hearings for the amendment of excavation regulations, driveway regulations, floodplain regulations. So all through this, the relationship that zoning has, that's the relationship they have to the other land use regulations, is that they're all under the purview of the planning board, and that the floodplain, the historic, and driveway and excavation are under the purview of the planning board for amendment. And the planning board's requirement for those is to hold a public hearing. And that's the same with the historic regulations are the planning board's authority is to hold a public hearing, in addition to the building and fire codes. So again, as we look at zoning's relationship to other land use regulations, the zoning ordinance is your rule book. And the rule book is the implementation that stems from the master plan, which is the top of the food chain, like I like to say. And from the master plan comes your land use regulations and what the communities can decide on what they want to regulate. If they just want to regulate subdivisions, then that's the path they go. If they want to regulate site plan applications and multifamily developments, then they go site plan regulations. But overall, the zoning ordinance is the glue to implementing the goals and the objectives of the master plan through what the community wants to regulate through. And so basically speaking, again, the zoning amendment is any type of change to the zoning ordinance, which includes any graphs, any charts, any language, and also the map, the zoning map. So every local master plan, subdivision regulation, site plan regulation, historic regulation shall be adopted or amended by the planning board or the historic district commission. And when you are adopting, just to make sure that if you are amending the zoning map, in addition to the zoning ordinance, make sure that they match, and also make sure that the public notices for the zoning map would be treated the same as for a zoning amendment. If you're changing a zone or adding a zone, extending a zone or a district, you need to make sure that the map is included in your amendments. That also includes any adoption or amendments to the building and the fire codes. So again, the planning board is responsible for the majority of the amendments. They're in charge of the zoning ordinance, but that also doesn't mean that the governing body of the municipality or that would be your village district commission, your city council, your board of selectmen can also propose zoning amendments. You can also have a petition zoning amendment. That is where 25 or more registered voters of the municipality can petition the planning board for a zoning amendment. And when you're proposing a zoning amendment, the language is very important, and the style or the template that we like to say needs to be uniform. So all zoning amendment language needs to follow the same type of style and format. So make sure that you're checking with your town clerk. Obviously, you hear me say all the time, checking with your town attorney for the correctness and the style of the zoning amendment. Each zoning amendment, there has to be a statement of whether or not the planning board supports or not supports the proposed amendment. You should also make sure that you're having the reason or the justification for this statement along with the zoning amendment. That is just it's a courtesy to the voters. It's almost a necessity to where the planning board can explain in one or two sentences, why they're proposing this zoning amendment. And the governing, and just to make sure that we're clear for, the planning boards, when they propose a zoning amendment, they hold the public hearings. They can have one, two, or more public hearings to amend language of the proposed amendments. If the public has, changes to implement, all of that can be done through the planning board zoning amendment process. However, if it's the governing body or a petition zoning amendment, the language that is in that amendment cannot be changed by the planning board or by the petitioner or by the board of selectmen or the governing body, whomever else submits that petition. That language is set forth, which is why it's good to talk with the planning board, talk with the town clerk, just make sure that whatever language a petition amendment is proposing fits the format, and that in realizing that it's the language cannot be changed. So, what should be taken into consideration when you are considering zoning amendments? I would review the sections of your zoning ordinance that may have multiple variances or special exception applications. To me, that would send up a red flag that, why are there so many variance applications for a particular section of the ordinance? And when I say so many, several, 5 to 7 applications per year from one section or one general section of the ordinance. That's kind of a red flag that something may be awry there, that you may want to look at the language. Is it confusing? Is it too restrictive? Those are things to consider with the zoning board of adjustment and with your code enforcement officer. Make sure that you're talking to other municipal boards and staff. The Conservation Commission probably works with certain sections of the ordinance. Are there any issues that they run into? Maybe if through your wetlands overlay district. But it's important to keep communication open with other boards and municipal staff that use the zoning ordinance to make sure that you're not missing anything, and some of the language that you're working with is easy to understand. Again, this is the community's rule book where your lay person, your average person should be able to understand and utilize the book without too much, without too many problems, without too many problems of comprehension or intention with your amendments. Make sure, my favorite thing, make sure you're reviewing the table of permitted uses and your definitions. You should not have a use without a definition, and you should not have a definition without a use. So make sure that every year that you're going through that table of permitted uses and definitions, and make sure that they all match. If you're struggling with any type of definition, you can certainly, utilize the American Planning Association. You can utilize our office. We'll be glad to help you out. I will, with any type of definition that you may be struggling with. Say you're trying to find a definition of a doggy daycare, which could be a little bit different than a kennel. Reach out, go to the APA, contact us. The other thing that is very useful and what the courts also utilize is just your basic Webster's dictionary definition. And again, speak with your town attorney about definitions and what you're trying to accomplish to make sure that legally, the verbiage that you're using is appropriate and easy to understand. Like I've said, review other regulations against the zoning ordinance to consider for amendments. You may find a mistake. Something may need to be changed, whether you're reviewing the master plan, whether you're reviewing subdivision regulations, there may be conflicts. So you want to make sure that when you have the opportunity to do a zoning amendment, that you're fixing something instead of creating an issue. So make sure that everything is you're making sure that cross-referencing different land use regulations, there isn't an issue with conflicting regulations. You may want, if you are citing any state RSAs in your ordinance, I would recommend that you follow that with an as amended. If you cite RSA, 155E, the excavation regulations, I would, include as amended, because if the state goes ahead and amends those regulations, then you're keeping up to date with them. If you're just citing one section, you could be running into an issue where your ordinance is out of date and you're not aware of changes to the state RSAs. Again, consulting with your town attorney to see whether or not it's worth it for a planning board or a municipality to adopt a housekeeping clause. Again, town meeting happens once a year, and there's things that can be cleaned up. Maybe you want to remove a few sections for space, for continuity. Maybe there's a few typos that you find. So consult with your town attorney to see if it's worthwhile to adopt a housekeeping clause. That way, the planning board, you can clean up the ordinance without having to go to town meeting, without wasting space to do an ordinance amendment to, delete numbers 45 through 47. That seems a little bit wasteful to post that for a public hearing. Maybe it's worthwhile for you to do a housekeeping clause. Now, a little bit more about petition zoning amendments for under types of amendments you can have. Again, that's 25 registered voters that can amend or appeal the zoning ordinance, the historic ordinance, or the building codes. Petition zoning amendments must be received to the municipality between 120 and 90 days prior to the town meeting. So again, or the village district meetings. But again, for the town meeting purposes, that would be before the second Tuesday in either March, April, or May. If you have the petition to zoning amendment, it first goes to the governing body, and they would then forward that to the planning board. The first planning board meeting after they receive a petition would be when the planning board would set the date for the public hearing and the petition. So it could be something simple like as an agenda item. Planning board chair could announce, or staff could announce and have it be an agenda item that they've received a petitioned amendment. The board acknowledges that they've received the petitioned amendment and then announces that, yes, we will hold a public hearing on September 8th at such and such time. So that's what would happen with the petitioned amendment once it's submitted to the governing body, or the governing body themselves submits it to the planning board. Again, petitioned amendments cannot be altered by the planning board or by the governing body. The language that is submitted is the language that moves forward. So just be very clear of that. If you see petitioned amendments, if you receive a petitioned amendment, the planning board's responsibility is to just hold the public hearing and then decide whether or not they support it or not. So that does it for the first section of our zoning amendment webinar. I'm going to turn it over to Christine now, and she's going to talk about building codes and fire codes amendments. So thank you, Christine.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'll preface my remarks by saying there is a literal cat fight going on upstairs in my house right now. So you may hear things. So I'm going to talk a bit about the state building code and the state fire code. The state building code was adopted, I think, in 2002 to provide some kind of a floor for all buildings in New Hampshire. It applies to everything in New Hampshire, although, and this may come as a surprise to some of the smaller communities, towns and cities and village districts do not enforce the state building code unless they have formally adopted enforcement of that code. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So the current state building code is authorized in RSA 155A, and it currently includes the International Code Conference 2018 versions of the building code, existing building code, the plumbing code, mechanical, energy and residential codes, and the NFPA 2020 electrical code, except for very specific provisions regarding arc fault circuit requirements. There are also some specific modifications to each of those codes that the state has adopted. Those can change every year. The legislature votes on updating those codes with recommendations from the State Building Code Review Board and from the State Fire Marshal. So to the extent that your municipality enforces them, they do change yearly, so you probably want to check on that. As I said, all new buildings have to comply with the state building code, and any building that's renovated, altered, or repaired. And permits are necessary. However, if your municipality has not specifically adopted enforcement of the state building code, then this is done through the state fire marshal. And it's the responsibility of the contractor who is building the building to get a permit from the state fire marshal for this. If you have adopted enforcement of the state building code and potentially additional amendments and additional requirements on top of that, then they would be required to get that permit through your municipality, through the building inspector. If a municipality wants to adopt additional provisions and enforce the state building code, the process for doing that is the same as for zoning ordinances and zoning amendments. So all of the things that Stephanie just talked about would happen with adoption of enforcement of the state building code. And it can be something as simple as adopting a very simple provision to the zoning ordinance that says the town will enforce the state building code, and then it will include these various things that are on the slide right now. RSA 674-51 requires that a certain amount of, requires these certain things be in your warrant article to adopt enforcement of the state building code, or it's not effective. So the date of the first local enactment and amendment, there has to be an establishment of a local building code board of appeals, which can be and very often is the zoning board of adjustment. But that needs to be formally designated in your ordinance. There must be a person called a building inspector, and that person must be authorized to do inspections, to issue building permits, to issue certificates of occupancy, to charge fees. The fee schedule for permits and inspections and all of that either needs to be right in your zoning ordinance with this adoption, or, which is much more flexible, you'd need an authorization in your ordinance that says the governing body can adopt and amend these fees. That's much more flexible because, as Stephanie said, town meeting is once a year. So this way, the selectmen or city council or town council can has the flexibility to amend the fees as they find necessary or appropriate. A word about inspections. RSA 155A7 says that the local building code inspection enforcement authority, so the building inspector, can conduct inspections. But that doesn't mean that the building inspector can enter private property without permission. They still should set up a schedule for inspections, work with the property owner on that. And if they end up in an enforcement type situation where they need to do an inspection, but they are not getting cooperation from the property owner, they do have the authority to get an administrative inspection warrant. I have seen provisions in zoning ordinances that purport to give a building inspector authority to enter anybody's property. I don't recommend that. And if it's in there, I don't recommend using it. Talked about fees. The certificate of occupancy. It's optional whether you require a certificate of occupancy. It is generally encouraged because what that means is it gives the building inspector the opportunity to do a post-construction inspection and make sure that everything has been done according to the building permit. Anything else there? Oh, one other thing. As I said, enforcement of the state building code requires a formal adoption of that by the municipality. There are, in many communities around the state, requirements for something called a building permit, and that permit is issued by someone called a building inspector. But if that municipality has not adopted enforcement of the state building code, what that person is really doing is issuing a certificate of zoning compliance. You can call it whatever you want, but this formal adoption is what's necessary in order for the building permit to be issued under the state building code. So there are some new requirements that took effect at the beginning of this year for local amendments to the state building code. Previous to this year, it was possible for a municipality to adopt, through the zoning amendment process, additional or more stringent requirements on top of whatever was in the state building code. So you'd be enforcing the state building code plus whatever your additional requirements are. There are other international conference conference codes, such as the International Property Maintenance Code, that are not part of the state building code, but there are communities that want to enforce that or particular parts of that code. So that would be an example of an amendment or an additional building code provision that you could adopt. So previous to that, you could just adopt it like a zoning amendment. Now there's an additional requirement for a state review. So for any amendment or addition to the state building code, the municipality has to submit the proposed amendment to the State Building Code Review Board for review to confirm that the proposed amendments do not conflict with and are not less stringent than the state code. For cities, these proposed amendments have to be submitted at least 90 days before the planned city council vote to adopt them, or if it's a city where voters have to vote, whatever the vote is. So at least 90 days before that. For towns, the submission has to be done within 10 days after the final public hearing that's held by the planning board before town meeting. And then the State Building Code Review Board has 90 days to provide a response for cities and 45 days to provide a response for towns. If they don't respond at all, then the proposed amendments are deemed to be approved by the state. So you can go ahead and vote on them. You could get a response that says, it will tell you what's wrong with it, supposedly. And then the problem with that is if there's something wrong with it, you probably don't have time to change it at this point. A city has a lot more flexibility because they don't just vote once a year, so they can put off their planned vote. For town meeting, however, if the state says there's a problem with something, there will not be enough time before town meeting to fix it. So it will probably have to be pulled and you'd have to try again next year because these deadlines are set up to just get you the approval that you need before town meeting occurs. So then, assuming that you get the green light from the state, then the town or city goes ahead with its vote on the proposed amendments. And then within 30 days after the municipality votes, if they vote to adopt it, a copy of the adopted amendments have to be filed with the State Building Code Review Board, along with proof that the public hearings were properly noticed and properly held, and that the vote approved, that the voting body approved it. And in addition, you can't enforce those new provisions unless and until you actually make those filings. These are new provisions that were just adopted and became effective in January of this year. And I don't have any feedback yet from the towns and cities that I work with about whether they have gone through this process and whether it was smooth, what it was like. So if anyone on the webinar today has feedback on that, perhaps at the end we can talk about that. I would love to hear about it. But I think for most communities next year, the 2024 town meeting cycle will probably be the first time if you happen to be doing this process. The fire code, similar to the building code, it applies all over the state to any new construction and renovation. And the state fire code is an RSA 153. It includes the life safety code, NFPA 101, the 2018 version, and the uniform fire code, the 2018 version. And then there are state rules under Safe C 6000 for that. It does apply in limited situations to existing buildings, even if they're not being renovated. So similar to the building code, anyone who is doing construction or owns property is responsible for making sure that they are in compliance with the state code. The state fire code is enforced by the local fire chief. So it's interesting, the state building code is enforced in the absence of a municipal enforcement. It's enforced by the state fire marshal. The state fire code is enforced by the local fire chief. So the fire side of things is really handling a lot in this case. So the local fire chief enforces the state fire code. They have very broad inspection authority, and they can adopt their own additional fire prevention bylaws. And those are adopted by the fire chief. However, the municipality also has the option to adopt additional provisions of for the state fire code that are more stringent than the state fire code, or additional things that are not part of the state fire code. And similar to the building code, if there are local amendments to the state fire code, they also now have to be submitted to the state fire marshal, not the building code review board, to confirm that they don't conflict with and are not any less stringent than the state fire code, and that they are based on sound engineering practices. Unlike the state building code process, all that RSA 153-4-A says about this is that local amendments to the state fire code shall be submitted to the state fire marshal for review prior to enforcement. It doesn't say whether it's before or after they're adopted. It doesn't say how long the fire marshal has to review them. So it also doesn't say that you have to submit them again afterward with proof. So it's a little vague at this point how that's going to work. I checked this morning and there are no updated rules so far from the state fire marshal's office on how this is going to work. Again, if anyone has experience with this, please let me know. And otherwise, I'm going to turn it back over to Stephanie.
Okay. Thank you very much, Christine. So going through our zoning amendment process, so and the notification process, talking about the different types of ordinances, your building, your fire, and your zoning. What is the legislative body process? So how do we get this done? And like we've talked about, Christine and I have both mentioned that in towns, the zoning ordinance is amended by the legislative body, which is town meeting or a special town meeting. But again, that's once a year to change zoning. So that's why the zoning amendment process, preparing for it, having the right format, having enough public hearings, having enough advertising, all those ingredients are really important in the town meeting form of government to make sure that your amendments are successful to pass. So that's something to always keep in mind, that towns have a much harder time amending their zoning ordinance because it's once a year. Because in cities and in town councils, or what the municipal charter decides, what the zoning amendment process is, but cities can do it as well as at any time of the year. And the planning board, again, must hold at least one public hearing for all types of zoning amendments, whether it's petition, whether it's building with fire, whether it's historic, whether it's by the Board of Selectmen, or whether it's by the planning board, that you must hold at least one public hearing. And again, with this town meeting form of government, and with how close we all know, whether you're SB2 or not, of how tight the public hearing time frame is to hold these hearings for your zoning amendments. If you run out of time, then you may not have a complete zoning amendment to pass. So make sure that you're paying attention to the zoning amendment calendars. New Hampshire Municipal Association, as well as our office, publishes, and I believe they're both out now, both organizations, your zoning amendment calendars. It's traditional March, April, and May, and SB2 communities, as far as when these you should pay attention to when you need to have your first public hearing. It's very, very important to make sure that your dates are kept up with and that you are not missing any deadlines to have a public hearing.
Can I add something, Stephanie?
Absolutely.
At that point, I found in the past that it can be really useful, even if a planning board thinks it only needs one hearing on zoning amendments, to plan for two. Build out the schedule ahead of time and plan for two public hearings, and you can always cancel the second one if you don't need it. But if you've already scheduled it and provided the notice for it, then you're ready to go if you need it.
Yeah.
More often than not, it gets used.
Right. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. That's why start the process early, and really, because once you get down to it, whether you're traditional or SB2, you're dealing with the holiday time of year, you're dealing with bad weather, December, January, February, all these times to have, public hearings, and the time is really crunched. So it's really important that, you plan for your public hearings, and overschedule a public hearing instead of having an amendment, not be able to move forward. So yeah, perfect point. And the public hearing requirements. So the zoning amendments are very similar to public hearing requirements for an application, wherein you need 10-day calendar notice, excluding the day of the hearing and the day of the posting. and it should be in 2 public places in your municipality. Notice can also be published in the newspaper and of general circulation in the municipality, as well as on the town's website. Just make sure that if you're using the website, it's a website that's updated, often. Anybody in town can request a notice to be sent of all public hearings for zoning amendments. The municipality has to comply. It may be provided electronically or by first-class mail, and that cost is borne by the municipality. So I know that their email lists are very popular now, so that anyone could sign up for that for a municipality to be notified of when public hearings for zoning amendments will be happening. And the public hearing notice, the full text of the amendment is not required. That doesn't mean that you don't have to provide it. That just means in your notice to the public, you do not have to put the whole entire language of the zoning amendment. Again, it's crucial why you discuss with your town attorney for posting what is the a good amount of language, the bare minimum for posting purposes and for cost for publishing in the newspaper of the description of the zoning amendment. And then the public notice should also say full text of the zoning amendment is available at the town hall. You can post it online, but the specific public notice of the zoning amendments does not have to have all of the zoning amendment language. Work with your town attorney on the language for your public notice. So mailing requirements for proposed zoning amendments. If the zoning amendment changes the boundary of a zoning district that affects 100 or fewer properties, if that is the case, then each owner in that district has to be notified of the effect. And that's the same if the proposed zoning amendment changes the minimum lot size or the permitted uses. Again, that notice needs to be mailed to the owner of each property. So that is a cost that is borne by the municipality. The address to use for that would be the address that the municipality has on file for the tax bills. So make sure that tax bill information is up to date. But and when in doubt, that's the address that you use to mail out notifications. If there's petition zoning amendments that would change a boundary or a district or a lot size or a use, then the petitioner is responsible to pay for the cost of the requirement for notifying the property owners. And if that's also, the governing body, then again, the governing body would be responsible, which would be the selectmen or the village district. They would be responsible to pay for the notification to each individual property owner in that district. Again, so your official ballot requirements. So before the final public hearing, talking about your language and your template for that. Before the final public hearing, the planning board and the municipal clerk need to make sure that the language that they are proposing is suitable for the ballot within that format. Again, back to that template, the template of what the ballot should say. So again, simple language can be, are you in favor of the adoption of the amendment to the town zoning ordinance as proposed by the planning board as follows? And then your amendment would be there. As an example, proposing to change minimum lot size from 20 acres to 10. And then you would put the planning board supports this amendment with the vote. I've seen it done both ways, with a vote or just a blanket statement that says the planning board supports this. And then the reason why you're going to propose that change. The reason why we are doing this is to, increase housing. Boom. Or whatever your reason is. A one-sentence statement that's included with that amendment on the ballot is crucial for people to understand and increasing your chances of passing the amendment if they understand. So an official copy of the final proposed amendment, again, shall be placed on file with the town clerk. Pay attention to your deadlines. These administrative deadlines that are not followed can sometimes make your house of cards come tumbling down if the public has not been made available or if it's not been filed on time. So make sure that you're paying attention to your deadlines and make sure that your final amendments are submitted to the town clerk, municipal clerk, within the correct time frame. Because once you're done with the public hearings and it's final, that you can't talk about them anymore. You can't make changes to them. You can't make amendments to them. So just be aware of that. The planning board has done their job when you've crossed the finish line. When you submit those amendments to the town clerk for the filing, that these are what's going forward to the ballot, and then there's no changing them. Some best practices I've found, again, starting early in the process. It's the most wonderful time of year. It's zoning amendment time. For the planning boards that only meet once a year, I would highly recommend that you start adding work sessions. Maybe it's, again, a discussion with your town attorney. Maybe it's something that could be added or should be added or needs to be added to the rules of procedure about when you meet. But in any event, meeting twice a year, or at least during zoning amendment time for the planning board, is crucial in the success and the preparing your zoning amendments. Keep a running list of amendments all year. It's very, being for zoning amendment time, being really organized is very, very helpful with the process, and it's very helpful to your chances of getting an amendment passed. So by keeping a running list of things that you run into, as far as, we have a lot of problems with this interpretation, that's something that you could bring up with the zoning officer, with the building inspector. But a running list is very helpful to keep you organized, and also to get an idea of how many amendments that you're going to have. And you can present to the planning board, hey, we had 15 zoning instances this year of things that we think we should change. The planning board would be the one to kind of sift through that and prioritize which ones are low-hanging fruit, which would be easy, which ones are more detailed. But that's why you keep a running list, to help prepare the board.
Stephanie,
Again, yes?
we got a couple of questions, and
Okay.
one I think is relevant to the timeline. The other one is more of a, I think, after question. So when is the
Okay.
earliest we can have a public hearing for a zoning amendment? If we are ready with housekeeping changes, can we start public hearings soon?
Yes. We will talk about that a little bit, but yes, there is, and we did talk about it in 676-12, is the earliest that you can have a zoning, hold a public hearing. But there's nothing stopping you from holding public hearings now. It's just that this is the earliest that you can, and that's the RSA is 676-12, which states it's 120 to 90 days, correct, Christine? Before town meeting.
You're
Sorry.
muted, Christine.
120 days.
Yeah. So back out 120 days. For traditional town meetings, usually that date would hover around November, maybe like the second week in November.
And that's what the NHMA, and I think your calendars as well, they're keyed to that. So there should be something on the calendar that says first date to hold public hearing.
Yep. And when I was a town planner, that I jumped all over that date, because that's the date that I would use for what, the low hanging fruit or the housekeeping ones, where, I could do it. It was real quick. We had our hearing, and then, save the rest of the time to schedule your public hearings, because you can then have another public hearing 10 days from that. You don't necessarily have to, follow a specific, NHMA calendar or our calendar. Once you start that, you can stagger those 10-day notices to have your first hearing. The zoning amendment calendar deadlines are just letting you know this is the first of the last time that you can hold a public hearing. So there's nothing stopping a municipality from having it earlier or more frequently. I hope that answered your question. So again, getting back to, just make sure that you're keeping track of the zoning ordinance with your variances and your special exceptions. Look for your red flags. Are you having people or boards or other municipal staff or the public, applicants, anyone that's having a difficult time with a certain section of the ordinance, repeated applications? Those are all worth looking at and discussing with the building inspector or whoever is enforcing the zoning ordinance. Which, at least, talk to your town staff, your other municipal boards and commissions. Again, the Conservation Commission may be working with stuff, the Historic District, they need to be in the loop, and keep the communication open with town boards for your main rule book, so that it's easy to understand. Keep your language, easy to understand. Again, this is a rule book for everyone in the municipality. It should be of general language. We love our town attorneys, but don't get too legal language in it. It can be hard for people, even hard for me, to sometimes decipher a lot of legal language. So just make sure, again, you're communicating with your town attorney, explaining to them, this is what we'd like to do, this is why we're doing it, work on the language, and your town attorney will help you with getting that legally correct language on your amendment. It's really important. I think one of the most important things is to make sure that the zoning amendment is represented. Okay, even at your public hearing, even at the polls, even on election day. It's important to have someone there, maybe a planning board member, staff, the planning board chairperson, the person who presented the petitioned amendment, or if the governing body presented an amendment. It's really important for them there to be there to represent the amendment. In case people have questions, they can explain it. And again, keeping good records and minutes of your zoning amendment file. Make sure you're documenting what worked, what didn't work, why the planning board moved forward with something, why they didn't. We'll catch up with that next year. Being really organized and keeping good records is really important for zoning amendment time. And like I've said, make sure that you're cross-referencing with other regulations, because you don't want to create a zoning amendment or zoning ordinance, a provision that conflicts with another section of the ordinance itself or other your land use regulations. And, again, another rule, you don't take on too many amendments. I really kind of shudder when I see and I hear, oh, we had, 10 zoning amendments, oh, we had 12 zoning amendments. And I think, oh my gosh, that's a lot. It's a lot for many reasons. It's a lot for the public to understand and comprehend and be willing to pass that many. It's really hard on the board. It's expensive for the municipality to notice all of that. So it's a lot of prep for staff. So overall, I would really strongly recommend that you keep your zoning amendments, I would say anywhere between 5 and 7 if you have to.
And that doesn't mean just combine 15 of them into 5 or 7, because you're supposed to have a separate zoning amendment for each general subject that is being amended. So if there are changes to district boundaries for, this purpose, and then you're going to talk about something dealing with wetlands that's completely separate, and then there's going to be a short-term rental section, you can't throw those all into one thing. They have to be separated out.
Yes, thank you. Perfect.
And we only have one amendment. It's 45 pages long, but it's one.
Right. Yeah, we don't want that either. Again, your goal is, for all your work and the months of prep and everything that everyone goes through, the noticing and the advertising and the public hearings and the changing and the deciding, you want to, give yourselves the best opportunity for the amendment to pass. So keep your language simple, keep it short, and keep the numbers reasonable. And here again, we just spoke about that. It was a question. It's a little bit more information here. Is I strongly recommend taking advantage of our RSA 67612, where it talks about the having the first public hearing 120 days prior to your annual meeting. That's when you can first legally start holding your public hearings and getting stuff done, getting stuff out of the way, your low-hanging fruit. Or maybe you want to start with your more difficult zoning amendment and start that early, and then know that you have the low-hanging fruit, the easier ones on later on in your process. Don't forget the town attorney. Again, your biggest ally, your biggest resource. Use them for this very important time of year. Make sure that you are not waiting to the last minute and frantically sending your proposed amendments the day before the public hearing to your town attorney. Involve them early, and do not publish or finalize any zoning amendments that have not been at least reviewed and understood for the town attorney. So the town attorney, as you hear me say, no matter what webinar that I give, is the town attorney is make sure that you're talking with them and keeping in touch with them, let them know what the board is looking for. What are the board's goals with this amendment? It'll help the town attorney help you with the language and help with getting in the right format.
It's cheaper to come to us first.
Yes, exactly. Yes, absolutely.
Virtually every town attorney would be happy to charge for a very small amount of time up front, rather than have to clean something large up after the fact.
Absolutely. That's very true. So that we're kind of wrapping it up here. We have about 10 minutes for questions. So again, please make sure that you check out our website. New Hampshire Municipal Association is also available for, they also have a legal inquiries feature, so you can reach out to them for legal advice. The American Planning Association website, NECAPA and New Hampshire planning commissions are also very helpful for resources and materials to help you through the zoning amendment process. I'm always glad to help. If you're looking for definitions or need help during the zoning amendment process, please feel free to reach out to us through our MRA program. As well as, you know, if you're having trouble with the definition, go to the dictionary. I was just reading a New Hampshire Supreme Court case today where they specifically talk about a certain municipality had a good definition, so they didn't even have to resort to the Webster's Dictionary. But frequently, and Christine can attest to this probably better than I, that the New Hampshire Supreme Court uses the references of a definition for something, and they'll go to the dictionary if the town's definition isn't clear or it's hard to understand. So make sure that your definitions are easy to understand. And our contact information, again, please, feel free to reach out to either one of us, especially with Christine. Please be very mindful that she's very willing to answer questions regarding the materials from this webinar today, and let you know that please reach out to use our website for past webinars, for our planning and zoning handbooks, our quizzes, and for our list of next webinars. And they'll be coming up very quickly. September 21st, myself and Michael Tardif, who is the Executive Director for the Central New Hampshire Regional Planning Commission, we're going to be talking about CIP, your Capital Improvement Program. So again, thank you very much for joining us today, and we will jump into the question and answer period. So Alvina, we are ready to go.
So the first one we got from Bob is a change of boundary or a wetland considered a change of boundary of a zoning district?
I don't believe so. For purposes of requiring notice to all of the property owners in the district of a potential change, I assume that's the question.
Bob didn't specify, but I'm hoping he's still on the webinar. He can clear that up.
Changing a size of a wetland versus like a wetlands overlay district kind of thing.
For purposes
so Bob
of
came back. Yes, for
okay.
purpose of noticing abutters. Yes.
So the requirement that you notify the individual property owners affected by a proposed zoning change if it changes the boundary of a zoning district. I don't believe that that would include changing the boundary of a wetland, because a wetland isn't a zoning district. Well, although it might be actually if you have a wetlands overlay.
Right.
But I think that I think generally the answer would be no. If it's a wetlands overlay district, chances are good that it affects a lot more than 100 properties. So probably the answer is no.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that too. Just the clarification of whether it's just for a wetland or if it's for the wetlands overlay district or a wetlands boundary. Yeah. So if Bob, we didn't answer your question, feel free to reach out again.
All right, so the next one is from Christine. How does a planning board and ZBA handle new applications submitted during the 120-day time period before town meeting?
Depends whether there's been public notice of a proposed zoning amendment that would affect that application. If there has been, what RSA 676-12 says is that the building inspector can't issue any building permits in that time for something that might not be allowed if that zoning amendment passes. But also, it also means that someone who files an application after the first legal notice of the public hearing on a zoning amendment that would affect that application, it's the public notice of the hearing is the key date at that point. So within 120 days before the vote, before town meeting generally, once there's been public notice of a hearing on an amendment, anybody who files an application with a planning board or a zoning board after that is going to be essentially bound by that amendment if it passes. So the zoning board and planning board can continue along and hear the application and do whatever it is they're going to do. someone should inform the applicant that there is this pending potential amendment to the zoning ordinance. You should be aware of it. If it passes, here's the statute. You might want to go talk with your lawyer about it because it may prevent you from doing this project, even if we were to approve it, because you'd be held to that amendment. So it's kind of the opposite of a grandfathering thing.
Right. Yeah, I would always kind of say, almost like a caveat emptor, like be very careful during that time of year because you're to an applicant, you could very well be wasting a lot of money and time and plans, bringing something forward if something in your plan is directly related to a zoning ordinance that's already been posted. So that's why it's really important, administratively, to keep track of all your postings, make sure that they're done in time. And because if you hit a little snag, then something like that can really upend an application or the process of it.
There are frequently times when there's a race between the planning board and developers because they know something is coming. And so they're trying to get their application in before you can get your public notice posted of the hearing on the proposed amendment.
Yeah.
So if that is of significance in your community, you want to make sure that your posting is as early as possible, so 120 days before a town meeting, and that it's correct and not defective for some reason.
Exactly. And don't let the developers or any applicant, kind of strong arm you. It's the same all across the state. This community, yeah.
They can, I've seen frequently that a developer will say, all right, well, why don't you just continue my application until we see what happens with this amendment. And that is fine too. I mean, there are deadlines for the ZBA and the planning board to deal with applications, but the applicant is always able to waive those deadlines. And sometimes they will want to, just to wait and see before they put all their money into it.
Yep.
All right, so the next one, Bob did clarify. He says it's not clear in our ordinance, which refers to wetland overlay district. That's with regards to his question about the abutter notice.
You may want to talk with your town attorney about that because they may need to look at your ordinance to see.
And one more question. Still confused on time of first public hearing. Can it be September for a March town meeting?
You can hold a public hearing anytime you want. The thing is that for it to, that there needs to be at least one public hearing within that 120 days on every proposed zoning amendment. That's just the way that it has been interpreted and applied over time, although I agree that the statute is not clear. And if you are racing against applicants, the notice of the proposed hearing is only effective to bind a new applicant to that amendment if it passes, if it occurs within the 120 days before town meeting.
All right, and last one is from our own Noah. Stephanie, can you speak about the value of preparing a guide for voters that explains a zoning amendment in plain English?
Yeah, that, and thanks, Noah, and appreciate that because we did touch on it a little bit just as far as, advertising your amendment, having someone there to represent it and ask questions, and advertising and having the public as much as you can be aware of the zoning amendment changes and why the change is coming, what the language means. You really have to sell it. There's community last round of town meeting that had about 8 zoning amendments proposed and they all failed. And so they've just wasted, a whole year of work, a whole year of prep, of research, of time, of energy, of money, of effort. Maybe it wasn't advertised enough. Maybe there was a wrinkle in some of the language that didn't understand. Yes, you do have political forces to deal with, but that's the more reason than not to advertise, to have someone there to make sure that what the board is looking to do, explain the reasons why, encourage the public hearings, advertise the public hearings a lot. I mean, it really is a lot of effort, but without a lot of effort or without, any of those, without the board being that proactive, without having someone at the polls, that can be a staff person, it could be a board member, it could be the petitioner, you're running the risk of the amendments failing. So it's very important to advertise, sell. You need to sell your amendments and sell the process, encourage the participation.
plain language is a good idea, because occasionally there's the provisions of a zoning ordinance. A zoning amendment is going to have to include more words than you would want it to, just because it needs to clarify things or work with the other sections. And occasionally there's kind of magic language that you have to include. But there is almost always a shorter way to say it that is a little bit less precise, which is why your attorney might not tell you that that's how you should say it. But if you're explaining it to people, if you use normal words that everyone understands, and then you can reference, here was this situation that happened, and we're going to try and, and fix that. Or we've heard from people that they're concerned about this, and so we're doing this. In a way that everybody, not just people who understand zoning, would get.
Right. And that's the thing. When you look at the schedule for having public hearings, when you look at, at least the more popular traditional or SB2 March town meeting, just plainly look at the calendar. Not a lot of people are going to come out in January and February, to look at zoning amendments. So you even need to take that more of that, that initiative. Or another reason why to start them early. Start your work sessions early. It's zoning amendment time. To make sure that people are out there, because the more support you have, the more people that understand it, the better chances that amendment is to pass. And then you're getting the public's input. Storms happen, vacations happen, holidays happen. It's a really terrible time frame to try to get work done, and that's the rub of the March town meeting. April and May as well, but that's the rub of town meeting. So it's really important to make sure that you're getting out there and advertising it, supporting it at the polls.
And one more. When you reference town attorney, we have a separate planning board attorney. Should we use that person instead?
Every relationship with the town attorney is a bit different, but the planning board is the board that's in charge of proposing zoning amendments, and they are the ones who have to hold the public hearings. So you may need to talk with whoever your general town attorney is as well, but I would say definitely talk with the planning board attorney, because chances are good that if something goes wrong with it, they are the ones who will have to defend you. So I'd start with them, right, but bring that question up. Ask them.
And then Glenn just made a note that letters to the editor with the explanations of proposed zoning changes are invaluable in the education process.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's still, the letters to the editor are still, a powerful tool and can be a widespread tool. So any of those assets that you have that you're able to, conjure up and work with, that, I highly recommend it.
And Stephanie, I have one for you. Can you note how important it is to also keep track of your amendments after you've adopted them?
Yes.
By year?
Yes.
Somewhere publicly available?
Yep. And again, and thanks, Alvina, it's a great point. Again, that goes into, your planning staff, your land use administrator assistants, all of your planning staff, even a planning board member as well. Keep a zoning amendment file on an annual basis. Keep track of the record of it. Keep track of why it, the numbers that it failed, why it failed, because for history purposes, for our purposes, as updating the municipal land use regulation survey, it's very important to make sure that your numbers are available and that the things are being being kept track of, that they're in perpetuity. You've got your folder, what happened. They all go in the town report, yes, but they're filed with the town clerk. But you really need to keep your files up to date and keep them organized as to what, how many public hearings you had, when did you start, all those types of things, and what passed, what didn't pass. It's very important. You need to make sure that when you update your zoning ordinance, it's of zoning amendments that actually passed, not just adding ones that were proposed but didn't pass.
And if you happen to be a community that uses MuniCode to publish your codes online, I have seen recently more than one fairly large community that has, for some reason, not had adopted zoning amendments included in MuniCode. So it's important.
Yeah.
That's where you find it.
Yeah, exactly. I would, understanding, small staffs, limited time, but having your codes up to date on your website is really important to get that done. And understanding that, they're big documents and it's a lot to update them. It's time consuming. Believe me, I know. But it really is important to make sure that your most up-to-date ordinance is online or available to the public, and especially to us, because they have to send them to us too.
All right, well, that's about it for questions,
Okay.
I think.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for your attendance, and most importantly, thank you very much, Christine, for your expertise and your time today. We
My pleasure.
appreciate it. Be glad to answer any follow-up questions that relate specifically to Christine will specifically to this to the webinar for these questions about zoning amendment stuff. And you can reach out to me anytime at the Office of Planning and Development. So thank you very much, everyone. Again, have a good day. Thanks for joining us.